The water here rarely rises above your knees. In 1996, an airliner flew into it and disappeared, leaving no fuselage, no tail, and almost nothing to lift out. Investigators worked in biohazard suits and chest-high waders, while a marksman watched the sawgrass for alligators. This is the Everglades, roughly 100 miles long, 60 wide, falling about 2 inches per mile. People blame the alligators, the snakes, the pythons. Those are the least of it. This ground does not attack. It takes away speed, landmarks, drinkable water, daylight, and every route in. Why can nobody reach you here in time? Start with the floor because everything else follows from it. Under the whole of the southern Florida peninsula sits a shelf of limestone, laid down when this was a shallow sea, then lifted and flattened and left almost perfectly level, not level the way a table is level. Level the way a parking lot is level after 50 years of settling, with dips and rises measured in inches over distances measured in miles. On top of that shelf sits peat and marl, the accumulated remains of plants that grew and died in standing water for 5,000 years. And on top of that sits the water itself, arriving mostly as rain, roughly 60 inches of it a year, 2/3 of it falling between May and October. That water has to go somewhere. In almost any other landscape, it would find a low line and cut a channel, and the channel would deepen, and you would end up with a river you could name, follow, and navigate. Here it cannot. The gradient through the Everglades is about 2 inches per mile. 2 inches. Over the distance from downtown Miami to Fort Lauderdale, the land drops less than the height of a coffee cup. Water moving down a slope that's shallow has no reason to concentrate anywhere. It spreads instead. It becomes a sheet, 60 miles across at its widest, a few inches to a few feet deep, sliding south at something like 100 feet a day in the deeper channels and considerably less everywhere else. 100 feet a day. Walk that in 4 seconds. A drop of water leaving the southern rim of Lake Okeechobee could take the better part of a year to reach Florida Bay, 100 miles away. Marjorie Stoneman Douglas called it a river of grass. And the phrase stuck so thoroughly that people forget what it actually means. It means a river with no banks, no channel, no visible current, no bends to recognize, no bar to beach a boat on, no cut bank to climb. If you are standing in the middle of it, there is nothing about the water that tells you which way it is going. You can watch it for an hour and see nothing move except insects and the wind on the grass tops, which kills the first idea anyone has when they realize they are lost in a wetland. Follow the water. Water runs downhill, downhill leads out, and out means people. It is a good rule. It has saved lives in the Appalachians and the Rockies and the Alaskan interior, where a trickle becomes a creek, becomes a stream, becomes a road crossing. Here the rule is worse than useless, because there is no trickle to follow and no creek for it to become. The flow you are trying to trace moves slower than the algae growing on your boots. And if you did somehow track it perfectly, in a straight line, at the speed it actually travels, you would follow it south for 100 miles into more of exactly the same thing, and then into mangrove, and then into a coast with no road on it. That is the first thing this place takes. Not your strength, your method. So look at the surface instead, because the surface is not uniform, and the pattern in it is the only map the interior offers. Seen from a low-flying aircraft, the Everglades is striped. Long, narrow ridges of dense sawgrass, oriented almost exactly with the direction of flow, separated by slightly deeper, more open channels where the water is a little clearer and the vegetation is water lilies and spicarush rather than sawgrass. Those channels are called sloughs. They are only a foot or so lower than the ridges beside them, and in the wet season the difference can vanish under a foot of standing water. But they are the closest thing the interior has to roots. Scattered through the whole pattern are the tree islands, teardrop-shaped in plan, pointed downstream, raised by anywhere from a few inches to a few feet on accumulated peat and, in some cases, on limestone outcrops. Hardwood hammocks, bayheads. Local names vary, their function does not. They are the only dry ground for miles in any direction. Everything about survival in the interior comes down to those two features. Sloughs are how you move. Hammocks are where you stop. Miss both, and you are standing in sawgrass with nowhere to sit down. Now shrink the view. Forget the 60-mile sheet and the striped pattern and the aerial photograph. Put one person in the middle of it at 4 in the afternoon in water 14 inches deep, wearing whatever they wore when they thought this would be a short trip. The bottom under that water is not sand. It is peat and marl, and where the peat is soft, a boot goes in past the ankle and comes out slowly, with a suck of released gas that smells like sulfur. Where the underlying limestone is exposed, it is pitted and sharp, riddled with solution holes that can be 4 inches deep or 4 feet deep, and there is no way to tell which until your leg is in one. So you probe with each step. That alone halves your pace before the vegetation is even considered. The vegetation is sawgrass. It is not a grass. It is a sedge, Cladium jamescens, and it grows in dense monotypic stands that can reach 9 feet, and in good conditions considerably more. Its leaves are strap-shaped, folded along the midrib, and lined on both edges and along the underside of that midrib with fine forward-angled serrations, hard with silica. They are not thorns. They are teeth, angled so that they let you push forward and catch you when you pull back. Brush a leaf edge with the back of your hand, and you get a line that does not hurt for a second and a half. Push through 100 yards of it, and you come out with your forearms, neck, and calves scored in dozens of shallow parallel cuts, each of them now soaking in warm standing water that contains everything the marsh contains. Here's the first real mechanism, and the injury is not the part of it that matters. The arithmetic is. Through open slough and shallow water, a fit adult on foot might make 1.5 miles an hour and be exhausted at the end of it. Through dense sawgrass on soft peat, that number falls under 1 mile an hour, and it keeps falling as the day goes on, because you cannot rest standing in water, and there is nowhere else to rest. And the nearest levee road may be 4 miles east. In a Colorado meadow, 4 miles is 90 minutes and a story to tell. Here it is, a 5-hour ordeal in the direction you have chosen, and you have no way of confirming the direction is correct because, from inside a sawgrass stand, your eyes are below the tops of the blades, and your horizon is 9 feet away in every direction. That is the second thing this place takes, not your position, your reference. There is no elevation to fix that. This is the part outsiders find hardest to believe, because every other wilderness offers some way to get above the problem. In forest, you climb a tree. In mountains, you gain a ridge and read the valley. In desert, you take a dune crest and see 40 miles. Here, the highest natural ground within a day's walk is a hammock that stands maybe 3 feet above the marsh, and its interior is closed hardwood canopy, so climbing it buys you nothing but shade. The tallest thing you will encounter all day is the sawgrass itself, and it is taller than you are. So you cannot see out, and you cannot see landmarks, and the sun is the only compass you have unless you brought one. In the middle of a summer afternoon in South Florida, the sun is close enough to overhead that it gives you a poor bearing at exactly the hours you are most likely to need it. Under overcast, which is most wet season afternoons, it gives you nothing at all. And you are standing in water you cannot drink. That sentence sounds like a technicality. It is not. Surface water in the Everglades is warm, slow, biologically active, and loaded with the bacteria you would expect in a shallow, subtropical wetland full of wading birds, alligators, and decomposing vegetation. Drinking it untreated is a coin flip with gastrointestinal illness, and gastrointestinal illness in a person who is already losing fluid at high rates in 90-degree heat is not an inconvenience. It is an accelerant. There is also mercury, which arrives from the atmosphere, is converted by wetland bacteria into methylmercury, and concentrates upward through the food chain into the predatory fish. Florida's health department has carried consumption advisories for Everglades fish for decades, and they are blunt. Do not eat bass caught north of the main park road, limit bass caught south of it to once a week, and children and pregnant women should not eat any of it. That advisory is about long-term diet, not a single meal, and it matters here for a different reason. It tells you that the most obvious survival food in the marsh, the thing anyone would try to catch first, is the one the state specifically warns about. In this landscape, even the food chain has a caveat attached, so the person standing in 14 inches of water is dehydrating. That combination is what catches people. Surrounded by water, soaked to the thigh, sweating through a shirt that never dries because the humidity will not let it, and losing fluid faster than in most deserts because the heat is coupled with humidity high enough to defeat evaporative cooling. Sweat that does not evaporate does not cool. It just leaves. By hour 4, the cuts on the forearms are inflamed, the mouth is dry, and the decision-making is already degrading in the specific way dehydration degrades it. Not dramatically, just a slow slide towards simpler, worse choices. Push on rather than stop. Guess a bearing rather than wait. Keep walking because walking feels like progress. Then the light goes. Sunset in South Florida in midsummer comes around 8, and in late December around 5:30. And either way, the transition is fast. In an hour, the sawgrass silhouettes flatten into a single black wall. Standing water reflects the last of the sky, and then stops reflecting anything. The mosquitoes, which in the interior during the wet season can be present in numbers that visitors consistently describe as beyond anything they had imagined, come up out of the vegetation in a way that makes staying still nearly impossible and makes sleep, for an unprepared person, out of the question. And here's the part that catches even Floridians off guard. The cold. South Florida is subtropical. The average low in the Everglades in January is comfortable. But averages are not what kills people. Cold fronts do. Between roughly November and March, frontal systems reach the peninsula and drop overnight temperatures into the 40s and low 50s Fahrenheit, sometimes lower. And the front arrives with wind and often with rain ahead of it. Hypothermia is most commonly seen in outdoor emergencies, not in freezing conditions, but exactly in that range, in the 40s and 50s, when people are wet and moving air is stripping heat off them, and nobody thinks of it as cold weather. A person who's been waiting all day is soaked from the chest down. Their clothing is cotton because they dressed for Florida. There is no dry ground within reach to lie on, no fuel dry enough to burn, and no shelter except vegetation that holds moisture. 48 degrees with a 15-mile-an-hour wind and wet clothes will take a healthy adult into serious trouble in a single night. Look at all of that as a chain rather than a list, because no single link in it is remarkable. Flat limestone makes shallow sheet flow. Sheet flow makes a surface that is neither land nor water, so nothing designed for land and nothing designed for water works on it. That forces travel onto foot, and foot travel through sawgrass and muck drops below a mile an hour. Slow travel means long exposure. Long exposure in heat without drinkable water means dehydration. Sawgrass means open wounds sitting in warm bacterial water. No elevation means no bearing. No bearing means the 4-mile walk might be in the wrong direction, and you will not learn that for 5 hours. And a winter night means that the temperature, in the one region of the continental United States nobody associates with cold injury, becomes the thing that finishes it. None of that involves an animal. Not one link. This is where the reputation of the place gets in its own way. Say Everglades, and people picture teeth. American alligators are genuinely abundant here, tens of thousands of them. And the Burmese python, established in the southern Everglades since the 1990s, has spread widely enough to collapse populations of marsh rabbits, raccoons, and opossums across large areas. The pythons are an ecological catastrophe. As a threat to a human being standing in the marsh, they are close to irrelevant. Alligator attacks on people in Florida are rare, and fatal ones rarer still, on the order of a handful per decade statewide across a state with more than 1,000 named lakes and 22 million residents. Venomous snakes are present, cottonmouths and pygmy rattlesnakes, and the occasional eastern diamondback on the hammocks. And they matter mostly because a bite 4 miles from a levee is a different medical problem than a bite 400 yards from a parking lot, which is the actual point. Every hazard in this landscape gets multiplied by the same number, and that number is how long it takes anyone to reach you. That is the variable. Injury, illness, snakebite, heat, cold, none of them decide the outcome on their own. Distance decides it. Access decides it. And access here is a genuinely difficult engineering problem, because the Everglades is the one surface that defeats nearly every vehicle humans have built. Consider the options honestly. A wheeled vehicle sinks in soft peat and destroys the marsh doing it. A tracked vehicle does better and still bogs and still tears the substrate. A conventional boat needs a channel, and there is no channel. A propeller in 14 inches of water over limestone lasts about as long as it takes to find the first solution hole. A shallow draft skiff can work the sloughs at high water and is stopped cold by a sawgrass ridge. A helicopter can hover anywhere, but hovering is not landing. Setting down on saturated peat means the skids or wheels sink unevenly, and an aircraft that settles at an angle in soft ground is one rotor strike away from becoming a second emergency. Miami-Dade's air rescue crews treat the marsh as ground you do not set an aircraft down on, which is why the hoist is not an accessory on their helicopters but a core tool. That leaves one machine that actually works, and it was invented for this problem. Flat-bottomed hull, no propeller in the water, an aircraft engine, and a caged fan pushing air, riding on top of the water and skidding over vegetation and mud alike. The airboat. It is loud, it is unsubtle, it draws almost nothing. And in the Everglades, it is not a tourist novelty. It is infrastructure. Everything that follows in this story, every rescue, every recovery, every search that succeeded or failed, is shaped by that single fact. The interior of the Everglades has essentially one fast door, and the door is a boat with a propeller in the air, launched from a levee, running at night, driven by someone who knows which slough connects to which raises an obvious question. And it is the right one to ask before any of the disasters. If the interior is this hostile to travel, this hostile to shelter, this hostile to water and fire and rest, how did anyone ever live in it? Because people did, for a long time. And they moved through it better than any army that came after them. The Seminole and later the Miccosukee did not adapt to the Everglades by being tougher than everyone else. They adapted by inverting the problem. Every difficulty described so far assumes you are walking. Walking is what a European-descended traveler does by default, and walking is the worst possible choice here. The people who lived in this landscape barely walked at all in the wet season. They floated. The vehicle was the dugout canoe cut from a single bald cypress log. Cypress heartwood contains an oil, cypressine, that resists rot and waterlogging, which matters enormously in a craft that spends its life half submerged in warm water. The hulls were long, some of them approaching 30 feet, and drew very little. They were not paddled through the interior. They were poled, standing, with a long push pole worked against the marl bottom, which is a completely different technique with a completely different set of advantages. Standing in a canoe puts your eyes 8 or 9 feet above the water, which is the exact elevation the landscape refuses to give a person on foot. From that height, you can see over the sawgrass. You can read the pattern of ridge and slough. You can see the profile of a tree island on the horizon and hold a line toward it. Read that again because it is the whole of the reversal. The single most valuable piece of equipment in the Everglades was not a weapon or a shelter or a supply of food. It was 3 extra feet of eye height. The routes were canoe trails, worked and reworked through the sloughs and across the softer sawgrass, some of them maintained across generations by the simple act of repeated use. The passage of hulls keeping a line open through vegetation that would otherwise close. Those trails linked the hammocks, and the hammocks were the settlements, dry ground, hardwood shade, elevation of a few feet, room for platform dwellings raised above the wet cook fires that would not drown, and gardens of corn, pumpkins, and sweet potatoes in the deeper soils. A hammock is a small island of ordinary life in a landscape that offers none. Camps were spaced along water routes at intervals that made sense for a day's poling. The system was not survival. It was a functioning geography with a road network, waypoints, and stopping places, all of it invisible to anyone who did not already know it. Then there was timing, which was the most sophisticated part. The Everglades has 2 seasons, and they are not warm and cool. They are water and no water. Roughly May through October, the rains come and the sheet spreads and the interior becomes navigable and the mosquitoes become intolerable. Roughly November through April, the water withdraws into the sloughs and the deeper solution holes, the sawgrass flats dry to cracked marl, and travel by canoe becomes impossible in exactly the places where it was easy 6 months earlier. Fish concentrate in the remaining pools, which is why the wading birds nest when they nest, and why anyone who wants to eat pays close attention to falling water. Fire moves through the dry sawgrass in the same season, sometimes lit by lightning, sometimes lit deliberately, and the burns open ground and drive game. So the calendar dictated everything. Where you could go, when you could go there, what you could carry, what you could eat when you arrived. Not as a matter of preference, as a matter of physical possibility. A route that carried a loaded canoe in September was a mile of cracked mud in March. And the same trip in the same direction with the same crew would take 4 times as long and cost 4 times as much effort. That is a technique that outsiders, then and now, consistently fail to copy. Not the canoe. The restraint. The willingness to let the landscape set the schedule instead of imposing one on it. Which is the fault line this entire story runs along. And it will keep reappearing in every era with different equipment attached. On one side, people who move when the Everglades permits movement. On the other, people who need to be somewhere by a date fixed elsewhere, a military campaign season, a harvest, a land sale, a departure slot, a shipping contract, a flight schedule. The landscape does not negotiate with any of it. It simply applies the same set of physical constraints to everyone, and the ones operating on an external clock absorb the difference. It is worth being clear about how the Seminole came to be here at all, because the romantic version of a people who had always lived in the swamp is wrong, and it obscures the actual point. The Seminole formed in the 18th century in northern Florida, out of Creek-speaking peoples moving south along with others, including people escaping enslavement in the southern colonies and states. They were prosperous. They farmed good land, ran cattle, and traded through Spanish and then American Florida. They were not swamp dwellers. They lived in the Everglades because of the Indian Removal Act of 1830 and what followed it, and the interior became a refuge because of a specific and brutal property. It was the one part of Florida the United States Army could not operate in. That property was about to be tested in the most expensive way the 19th century United States ever tested anything. By the 1830s, the pressure was land. Florida had become a territory in 1821, planters wanted the interior, and federal policy had settled on removal to Indian Territory west of the Mississippi. In 1832 and 1833, negotiations produced treaties whose validity the Seminole disputed then, and historians dispute now. And by 1835, the United States was operating on the position that the Seminole had agreed to leave. Many had no intention of leaving. In December 1835, the war started in earnest, and the opening was catastrophic for the Army. A column of about 110 soldiers under Major Francis Dade, marching from Fort Brooke toward Fort King, was ambushed in open pine country near present-day Bushnell. Only 3 men survived. That was in Central Florida, on relatively good ground, and it set the tone for a conflict the Army expected to finish in a season. It lasted almost 7 years. The numbers alone tell you something went wrong with the plan. The United States eventually committed more than 30,000 troops, regulars and militia together, across the length of the war, against a Seminole force that is generally estimated at fewer than 2,000 warriors. The final cost has been put at somewhere between $30 and $40 million, an amount that in the 1830s was a national-scale expenditure. Roughly 1,500 American military personnel died. And here is the figure that describes the terrain better than any battle account. Most of them were not killed in combat. Malaria and yellow fever accounted for the majority. Men died in camps, in hospitals, at Tampa and St. Augustine, on transports of fevers, contracted while standing in exactly the kind of warm standing water this story has been describing. The Army was not being outfought so much as outlasted, and it was being outlasted by the ground. Understand what a 19th century campaign actually required. Supply by wagon, which needs roads or at least firm ground. Artillery, which needs both. Cavalry, which needs forage and footing. Fixed camps, which need dry sites. Every one of those requirements fails in the Everglades. Wagons cannot cross sheet flow. Horses founder in muck and cut their legs on limestone. Cannon are irrelevant against an enemy that will not stand and has no fort to reduce. And the enemy could disappear into an interior where a pursuing column moved at under a mile an hour in single file, in water, in uniform, carrying 60 pounds, while the people they were pursuing moved by canoe at the speed of a fit man walking on pavement. Commanders understood the problem. People missed that part. They wrote about it. They asked for different equipment. They tried burning the sawgrass, destroying the hammock gardens, and campaigning in the dry season when the interior was more accessible on foot. And eventually, one of them did the only thing that could work, which was to stop trying to make the Army's methods function here and copy the ones that already did. The officer was Colonel William Selby Harney, and the reason he was willing to abandon standard practice is that the standard practice had already nearly killed him. In July 1839, Harney was posted on the Caloosahatchee River on the southwest side of the peninsula, running a trading post established under a truce. The situation looked controlled. There was an agreement in place, the camp was in a known location, and the mission was commerce rather than combat, which is exactly the condition under which a garrison relaxes. Before dawn on 23 July, a Seminole force attacked the camp. The soldiers were caught unprepared. Harney escaped by running into the mangroves and the river in his nightclothes and getting away by boat. And a substantial part of his detachment did not get away at all. That ambush is the pattern in miniature. And this landscape has imposed it on everyone who ever came in with an external plan. The plan is reasonable. The site is chosen. The initial condition looks like control. And the terrain that seemed like background turns out to be the deciding variable, because it determined who could approach unseen, who could withdraw, and how fast either could happen. The following year, the pattern repeated on a larger scale and against civilians. On 7th August 1840, a force under a leader recorded in the sources as Chiquica or Chakaika crossed from the interior to Indian Key, a small, prosperous salvage wrecking settlement in the upper Florida Keys, and attacked it before dawn. Estimates of the raiding party range widely, from around 60 men to well over 100. Several residents were killed, the settlement was looted and burned, and the raiders withdrew. Indian Key was not a frontier outpost in the wilderness. It had a hotel, warehouses, a wharf, and for a period it had been the seat of Dade County. A naval station stood a few miles away at Tea-Table Key, and it was undermanned that morning, its personnel largely sick. The salient fact for our purposes is not the raid. It is the withdrawal. The raiders came from and returned to the Everglades interior by water, and the United States had no practical means of following them there. That was the objective Harney was given in the autumn of 1840, with the approval of General Walker Armistead. Find the people responsible and reach them in a place no American force had ever penetrated. And Harney, having learned what he had learned on the Caloosahatchee, did not organize a conventional column. In early December 1840, he left Fort Dallas, on the Miami River where downtown Miami now stands, with about 90 men of the 2nd Dragoons and 3rd Artillery. No wagons, no horses, no artillery. They went in a fleet of canoes, and they went dressed and painted in imitation of the people they were hunting, partly for concealment, and partly because a uniform in that landscape is a liability rather than an asset. They poled and paddled west into the sawgrass on the water routes, guided by men who knew where the routes went. And they moved at the speed the marsh allowed, rather than the speed a campaign plan would have specified. It worked, and that is what nobody likes about it. They found the camp on a tree island deep in the interior, in an area now within Everglades National Park and still carrying the name of the man they were hunting. They attacked at close range. Chekika was killed. Harney had his body hanged from a tree, and 2 other captured warriors were hanged as well, which was a deliberate and public act meant to be reported. Then the column kept going. Rather than retracing its route east, it continued west across the entire width of the Everglades and came out on the Gulf Coast, completing what is generally described as the first crossing of the Everglades by a United States military force. Every element of that expedition is a copy. Canoes instead of horses. Poling instead of marching. Local guides instead of maps. Concealment instead of formation. Timing set by the water instead of by headquarters. Harney did not defeat the Everglades. He borrowed the only method that had ever worked in it from the people he was using it against. And here is the reversal that the triumphant version of this story leaves out. It changed the strategic picture, and it still did not produce the outcome the war was fought for. The Army had proven the interior could be entered. It had not made the interior controllable, and there is an enormous difference between those two things. You cannot garrison a sheet of water. You cannot patrol 60 miles of sawgrass with canoes. You can raid, and raiding does not hold ground. And there was no ground to hold. The Second Seminole War ended in 1842 the way it had to end. Not with a treaty, not with a surrender, but with the United States declaring the fighting over and quietly stopping. Most Seminole had been killed or removed west by then. Several hundred remained in the Everglades and the Big Cypress, and they were left there because reaching them cost more than removing them was worth. Their descendants are the Seminole tribe of Florida and the Miccosukee tribe of Indians of Florida, and both are still here, on land in and around the same interior. Fewer than 2,000 warriors, more than 30,000 troops, 7 years, somewhere near $40 million, 1,500 American dead, most of them from fever rather than fighting, and the interior, at the end, unsubdued. That is what happens when force meets this particular ground, and it establishes the rule the rest of this story keeps testing. The Everglades does not need to defeat you. It only needs to be slow, wide, wet, and featureless enough that whatever you brought stops being decisive. which is precisely the conclusion that produced the next idea. And the next idea was worse. If the water is the problem, remove the water. It sounds absurd stated that flatly, and in the second half of the 19th century it did not sound absurd at all. It sounded like progress, and it sounded like money, because underneath that sheet of water was several feet of black peat soil, and peat soil in a subtropical climate with a 9-month growing season is agricultural land of a quality that does not exist anywhere else in the continental United States. Drain it, and you would not merely have solved a nuisance. You would have created a new state's worth of farmland out of what maps of the period labeled, when they labeled it at all, as worthless swamp. The first man to take that seriously at scale was Hamilton Diston, a Philadelphia saw manufacturer who arrived in Florida with money and enthusiasm at a moment when the state government had neither. Florida in 1881 was effectively insolvent, its land holdings tied up by debt, unable to move forward on anything. Diston bought 4 million acres for $1 million, 25 cents an acre. It made him, at a stroke, the largest individual landowner in the United States, and it came bundled with a contract. He would drain and reclaim the land at his own expense and take a share of what he reclaimed. He went at it with dredges, working north of the Everglades proper at first, cutting canals to connect the Kissimmee chain of lakes and lower water levels upstream. Some of it worked. Steamboat routes opened, towns appeared, sugar was planted. But the core of the plan depended on lowering Lake Okeechobee, and Lake Okeechobee is a shallow dish 700 square miles across with a marsh rim, and it did not lower. His drainage operations wound down by the end of the 1880s. He never reclaimed the Everglades. He did establish something more durable than a canal, which was the belief that it could be done, and the belief was worth more to the people who came after him than any of the ditches. Napoleon Bonaparte Broward inherited that belief and made it a political program. He was elected governor in 1904, took office in 1905, and campaigned on the proposition that the state itself would finish what private capital had failed to do. He put it in terms voters could hold in their heads: dig a ditch from Lake Okeechobee to the sea, and the water will run out of the Everglades. From 1906, the state's own dredges were working, cutting canals east from the lake toward the Atlantic, the North New River, the Miami, the Hillsborough, the West Palm Beach. They did lower water levels. Not everywhere, not evenly, and not by as much as promised, but enough to change the northern Everglades permanently, and enough for the sales operation to begin. They also did something to the drinking water that nobody in 1906 was thinking about. And it is worth understanding because it explains why South Florida can never simply drain the rest of the Everglades and be done with it. The limestone under the southeastern Everglades is not solid rock. It is the Biscayne Aquifer, a formation so porous and so permeable that water moves through it almost the way it moves through gravel, and it is the sole source of drinking water for Miami-Dade, Broward, and southern Palm Beach counties. That aquifer is recharged from above by the same standing water that makes the Everglades what it is. The marsh is not sitting on top of the water supply. The marsh is the water supply held at the surface. Cut a deep canal through that formation, and you have not only drained the marsh, you have installed a drain into the aquifer itself, and you have connected it to the ocean. Fresh groundwater sits on top of salt groundwater and holds it down by weight. Lower the fresh water, and the salt front moves inland underneath. That is exactly what happened. By the drought years of the 1940s, salt water had intruded far enough into the Biscayne Aquifer to threaten and in places contaminate coastal well fields, and municipalities were forced to move their wells inland and build control structures near the canal mouths to hold the fresh water back. That is the trap the drainage era built, and nobody has escaped. To keep the cities dry, you must move water off the land. To keep the cities drinking, you must keep water on it. Every water management decision in South Florida since has been an argument between those two requirements, conducted through gates and pumps, and the Everglades is the surface where the argument happens. The sales operation is where this stops being an engineering story and becomes a story about how people ended up living in the path of what came next. Land companies sold Everglades tracts by mail, by pamphlet, and by excursion train to buyers in Chicago and Ohio and New York who had never seen South Florida. Some of them bought land that was under water at the moment of sale. The promotional literature described a garden. Purchasers arrived to find sawgrass and standing water and canals that had not yet reached them, and some of them turned around and left, and some of them stayed because they had no money left to leave with. Federal scrutiny eventually followed. The important consequence was not the fraud, though there was plenty of it. It was that towns now existed south and east of Lake Okeechobee, populated by people who had been told this was farmland in a place whose hydrology had been altered but not controlled. And the drained land immediately began doing something nobody had priced in. Peat is not soil in the ordinary sense. It is preserved plant material, and the thing preserving it is water. Saturated peat has no oxygen in it, and without oxygen, the bacteria that would otherwise consume that organic matter cannot work. Drain it, let air into it, and the process that has been paused for 5,000 years resumes. The peat oxidizes. It converts slowly and invisibly into carbon dioxide and water and goes into the atmosphere, and the ground surface drops. The measurements are stark. After initial drainage, surface elevations in what became the Everglades agricultural area fell at something like 9 centimeters a year, then settled into a long-term rate near 3 centimeters annually, dominated by oxidation rather than compaction. In recent decades, the rate has slowed as the remaining peat has thinned. Across the whole period, roughly 2 meters of soil have disappeared from the agricultural area south of the lake. Something on the order of 900 million metric tons of peat gone into the air. 6 feet of ground, not eroded away by a flood, consumed, in place, by the act of keeping it dry. Now hold two facts side by side, because together they build the trap that killed more people in a single night than any other event in Florida's history. The first fact: Lake Okeechobee sits at the northern end of this system, 730 square miles of shallow water. And before drainage, its southern rim was a broad marsh that the lake spilled into during high water. That spill was the origin of the sheet flow. It was not a flood. It was the normal operation of the landscape. The second fact: farms and towns now occupied that southern rim, and the ground under them was sinking. To keep the lake out, planters and the state built a dike along the southern shore, and they built it out of what was available, which was the muck and sand dredged from beside it. Roughly 5 to 9 feet high in most places. Earthen, unarmored. It held back a lake with 250 square miles of open water fetched to the north of it. An earthen dike is not a bad structure. It is a structure with a specific failure mode, and the failure mode is overtopping. Water going over the crest cuts into the downstream face. The cut deepens, the crest lowers, more water goes over, and the process accelerates until a section is gone. That mechanism was well understood in 1928 by engineers. It was not understood by the people living behind it, and nothing about the dike's appearance suggested it. It looked like a low hill with grass on it. There had already been a warning, and it had been read the wrong way. In September 1926, a major hurricane crossed Miami and continued northwest across the peninsula, and its winds pushed lake water into the southern rim. The dike was overtopped near Moore Haven, on the lake's southwestern shore, and the town flooded. Hundreds of people died there. The response was to repair and to raise the dike in places, and to carry forward a conclusion that sounds sensible and was fatal. The system had been tested, and the towns south of the lake, Belle Glade, South Bay, Pahokee chosen, had not been destroyed. Moore Haven was the vulnerable spot, and Moore Haven had been dealt with. The 1928 season was, for the Glades, a good one. Bean and vegetable acreage south of the lake had expanded, and the harvest required labor, and the labor came from the Bahamas and from the American South. Black migrant farm workers, many of them seasonal, living in camps and in the packing towns, working ground that had been under 3 feet of water 20 years earlier. The storm formed off Africa in early September, and it was tracked in the manner of 1928, which means by ship reports and by observations from islands in its path. It crossed Guadeloupe and Montserrat, then struck Puerto Rico on 13th September as a major hurricane, killing hundreds and leaving hundreds of thousands homeless. That much was known in Florida. Warnings were issued. Newspapers carried them. People in West Palm Beach and in the Glades towns knew a hurricane was coming and had roughly a day's notice. Here is where forecast quality stops being the relevant variable and human judgment takes over, because a warning is only as good as what people do with it, and what people did with it depended on what they believed about the ground. Some evacuated, those with cars and the money for fuel drove east toward the coastal ridge. Others waited, and waiting was not stupidity. It was arithmetic. Roads out of the Glades were few and poor and low, and a road that floods with you on it is worse than a house. Evacuating meant abandoning what you owned in a place where theft was a real concern and where your standing with an employer might not survive walking off during harvest. And there had been storms before that produced a scare, and nothing more. The 1926 experience, for the towns that had not flooded, had trained exactly the wrong lesson. Then there was the timing. The hurricane made landfall near Palm Beach on the evening of 16th of September, and it crossed the 40 miles inland to the lake in darkness. The worst hours in the Glades came at night, and darkness removes the one warning that would have been unambiguous, the sight of water rising against the far side of the dike. The physical mechanism is simple enough to explain in one breath, and that is what makes it so unfair. A hurricane's winds push surface water in the direction they blow. Over the open ocean that water has somewhere to go, down and away. In a shallow, enclosed basin, it does not. Lake Okeechobee averages roughly 9 feet deep and has no depth to absorb the push, so sustained wind across its long axis simply piles the entire lake against the downwind shore. Hours of northerly wind stack water against the southern rim. The lake tilts. The level on the leeward side goes up by feet while the windward side drops, and the whole thing is held there by the wind, like water tipped in a tray and kept there by a hand. Then the storm center passes, and the wind reverses, and the hand comes off the tray. Sometime on the night of 16th of September, and into the early hours of 17th September, the water on the southern rim rose over the muck dike. It did not need a wave to smash the structure. It needed to flow over the top, and once it did, the earthen face began cutting, and the sections went. What came through has been described in the record as a surge of 15 to 20 feet, moving across ground that was, by then, sitting lower than it had been when the dike was designed. The towns of the southern rim were built on that ground: Belle Glade, Chosin, South Bay, Pahokee, Bean City, frame houses and packing sheds and labor camps. Water at that depth does not flood a wooden building. It removes it. And then it kept moving, because the land south of those towns is the Everglades, and the Everglades is 60 miles of sawgrass with a 2-inch per mile gradient. There was nowhere for that water to drain to and nothing to break it. Survivors were carried into the marsh in the dark, some of them for miles, in water full of debris and building materials and displaced wildlife, with nothing to hold on to except floating wreckage and the tops of trees where any existed. People who reached tree limbs stayed in them through the night. Some who reached rooftops rode the roofs into open sawgrass and were never located. The initial official count for Florida was 1,836 dead. That number stood for the better part of a century, and it was wrong. In 2003, the National Weather Service revised the toll upward to at least 2,500, with an explicit note that the true figure was likely higher still. Both numbers deserve to be stated together, because the gap between them is not a rounding error. It is a description of who died. Around 3/4 of the dead were migrant farm workers, overwhelmingly black. Many were seasonal, from the Bahamas or from elsewhere in the South. And there was no reliable record of how many people were in the labor camps that week. You cannot count the missing if you never counted the present. And a great many bodies were carried into the Everglades by the same sheet of water that had no channel to confine it, and were never recovered at all. The recovery ran for weeks. Crews worked the canals, the sawgrass, and the muck fields in 90-degree heat, in the aftermath of a storm that had also destroyed the roads and the buildings recovery would have staged from. Bodies were recovered from canals and from the marsh, in some cases far from where anyone had lived. Burial was segregated, white victims to caskets and a cemetery in West Palm Beach, black victims to a mass grave, unmarked for decades, in a site that was used afterward for other purposes and only formally recognized much later. Some remains were burned in place because the conditions and the heat left no other option in the time available. Read that alongside where this story started. A wetland that is famously too shallow to drown in killed at least 2,500 people in a single night, and it did it by being shallow. If Lake Okeechobee had been deep, the wind would not have piled it. If the land south of it had a slope, the water would have run off. If the ground had not sunk 6 feet from being farmed, the dike would have been proportionally taller. Every property that makes the Everglades survivable in ordinary conditions is the same property that made that night what it was. The federal response was decisive, expensive, and revealing. Congress authorized what became the Herbert Hoover Dike, not a muck bank but a proper engineered structure, eventually running roughly 140 miles around Lake Okeechobee, 30 feet and more in height in places, with levees, spillways, and controlled outlets. President Hoover visited the devastated area, the Army Corps of Engineers took over lake regulation, and the Caloosahatchee and St. Lucie canals were enlarged to move water east and west to the coasts rather than south through the Everglades. After the floods of 1947, Congress went further and authorized the Central and Southern Florida Project, which over the following decades produced roughly 1,700 miles of canals and levees, hundreds of water control structures, and pump stations capable of moving water uphill. That project did what it was built to do. It ended the era of towns being erased by lake water. It made permanent agriculture possible on the southern rim. It made Greater Miami and the whole southeast Florida coast habitable for millions of people. And it changed the Everglades from a single continuous sheet into a set of compartments. Look at a satellite image of South Florida today, and you can see it without any training. Straight lines, enormous rectangles. The remaining Everglades north of Everglades National Park is divided into water conservation areas, each surrounded by levees and canals, each managed to a target depth by structures that open and close. Water no longer simply flows south. It is held, released, pumped, and routed on a schedule set by people in offices, balancing flood control for cities, water supply for agriculture, and more recently, ecological targets for the marsh itself, which produces the consequence that matters for everything that follows. And it is not the one anyone was aiming for. Those levees are the only high, dry, continuous ground in the interior of the Everglades. Every one of them has a maintenance road on its crest. Every one runs alongside a canal deep enough to launch a boat into. In a landscape with no roads, no ridges, and no reliable footing, humans accidentally built a network of narrow causeways straight through the middle of it, for reasons that had nothing to do with access. They are now the skeleton of every emergency response that happens out there. If you are in trouble in the interior of the Everglades, your realistic chance of being reached quickly depends almost entirely on your distance from one of those levees, because that is where the airboats launch and where the ambulances can meet them. And a levee that is 4 miles away might as well be 40, which is the arithmetic the next 50 years of this story is written in. People imagine rescue as an arrival. Someone is in trouble. Someone else comes. And the story is about the moment of contact. In practice, a rescue is a sequence of stages, each of which takes time, and each of which can fail on its own terms. And in the Everglades, every stage is penalized by the same geography. It begins with recognition, which means somebody has to know there is a problem and roughly where. That sounds trivial, and it is often the longest stage of all. A hunter who does not return by dark is not reported until whoever expected him decides it is late enough to matter, which might be midnight, and the report goes to a sheriff's office that has to establish where he launched from, what he was driving, and whether he simply stopped for dinner. Then authorization and assembly. Who owns the response? In the Everglades, that answer changes with the map. Miami-Dade Fire Rescue, Broward and Collier, and Monroe County agencies, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, the National Park Service inside park boundaries, the Coast Guard on the coastal and marine side, sometimes all of them at once, with a unified command that has to be built in the middle of the night. Every one of those organizations is competent. None of them can be everywhere, and the boundaries between them do not follow anything visible on the ground. Then, preparation and travel, which is where the geography bites hardest, and it bites twice. First, the responders have to reach a launch point, and launch points are not distributed conveniently. They are where a levee road meets a canal, or where a boat ramp exists, and there might be one within 20 minutes, or the nearest usable one might be an hour of driving away on unpaved levee crest in the dark, towing a trailer. Then the boat has to cover the distance from the launch to the person. This is the number that decides outcomes, and it deserves to be understood physically rather than as a statistic. An airboat on open water in a slough at night can move quickly. Over a sawgrass ridge, it does not. The hull rides up onto matted vegetation, and the fan has to push the whole boat across friction rather than water. And the driver has to know whether the ridge ahead is passable at the current water level, or whether it will strand the boat in the middle of it. In low water, the same route that ran in September will not run in March, so the boat does not travel in a straight line toward the target. It travels the route the water permits, which may be 2 or 3 times the direct distance, and which requires the operator to hold a mental map of a landscape that offers almost no visual reference at night beyond a spotlight beam falling on identical grass. Add darkness properly, because darkness here is not dimness. Away from the coastal glow, there are no lights of any kind in the interior. A spotlight from a moving airboat illuminates maybe 100 feet of sawgrass tops and reflects off standing water, and the reflection destroys depth perception. Searchers are looking for a person who is at or below the level of the vegetation, wearing dark or muddy clothing, possibly unconscious, possibly not making noise, in a marsh where sound behaves badly because sawgrass absorbs it, and an airboat engine drowns everything. The standard technique is to run, stop, cut the engine, listen, and run again, which means that the faster you search, the less you can hear. Aircraft help, and they help less than people expect. A helicopter with a searchlight and a thermal imager can cover ground far faster than a boat. And thermal is genuinely powerful at finding a warm body against a cool marsh at night. But the marsh in July is not cool. Standing water and vegetation that has absorbed a day of subtropical sun can hold enough heat to wash out the contrast a thermal sensor depends on. And when the aircraft does find someone, it still cannot land. There is nowhere out there to set an aircraft down, so the answer is the hoist. Hover. Put a rescuer down on a cable. Package the patient. Lift them back. That is a demanding evolution in daylight over calm water. At night, over vegetation that hides the actual surface, with rotor downwash flattening the grass and blowing spray, with a crew watching power margins and fuel, it is a serious piece of flying. And it takes time on scene that a fixed number of aircraft can only spend in one place at once. It is worth knowing what that capability actually consists of, because people assume it is limitless. Miami-Dade Fire Rescue's air rescue operation covers a jurisdiction of more than 2,400 square miles, and around 60% of that is Everglades. The fleet is 4 Leonardo AW-139 helicopters, split between North and South County bases, with an aircraft staffed and available around the clock every day of the year for firefighting, scene medevac, and search and rescue. Roughly 80% of the missions are scene medevac, which means the aircraft are mostly doing what helicopters do everywhere, picking up traffic and trauma patients from roadsides in one of the largest metropolitan areas in the country. One of the unit's captains has described the AW-139 as the Swiss Army knife of helicopters, which is a compliment about versatility, and also a quiet statement about how few aircraft have to cover how many kinds of emergency. 4 aircraft. One of the busiest urban areas in the United States, plus 1,500 square miles of marsh. That is not a criticism of the department, which is among the most capable in the country. It is arithmetic. When something happens in the interior at 2 in the morning, the response is drawn from a pool that is small, in demand, and already committed elsewhere, often enough to matter. So the honest summary is this. A person 4 miles into the sawgrass from a levee at night is looking at a response measured in hours from the moment anyone realizes they are missing. And there is nothing wrong with the response. The agencies are good. The equipment is modern. The hours come from the ground. Keep that number in your head, because it explains something that will otherwise look like negligence in the next part of this story. And it was not negligence. Which raises the question the whole system had never actually been asked. Everything just described assumes one person or 2. And a search that starts with someone noticing an absence. What happens when the number is not 1? What happens when 176 people arrive in the middle of that marsh, simultaneously, at night, at 200 miles an hour, with no warning, and roughly 75 of them are still alive when they stop moving? On the evening of 29th of December 1972, Eastern Airlines Flight 401 left New York's John F. Kennedy International Airport for Miami. The aircraft was a Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, registration N310EA, and it was almost new, 4 months in service. Wide body, 3 engines, a sophisticated autopilot, the state-of-the-art in commercial aviation. The crew was experienced. Captain Robert Loft, with close to 30,000 flight hours. First Officer Albert Stockstill, and Second Officer Donald Repo as flight engineer. There were 163 passengers and 13 crew aboard, and the flight was routine in every respect for the 2.5 hours it took to get to South Florida. At 11:32 p.m., the aircraft was on approach to Miami International. Stockstill selected the landing gear down. 2 of the 3 green indicator lights illuminated. The nose gear light did not. Understand the situation as the crew saw it, because it was not an emergency and they did not treat it as one. A missing green light means one of 2 things. Either the nose gear is not down and locked, which is a serious landing problem, or the indicator has failed, which is nothing. The aircraft flew normally. There was no vibration, no warning, no reason for alarm. Loft called Miami approach, told them they would like to keep the aircraft around a while, and asked to climb. They were cleared to 2,000 feet and vectored west, out over the Everglades, into a holding pattern in the dark. That decision was correct. It is what the procedure calls for and what any competent crew would do. Get out of the approach sequence, get altitude, get time, and solve the problem before committing to a landing. It also put a wide-body airliner over the one piece of ground in South Florida where an accident could not be reached. They set to work. Stockstill tried to remove and reseat the light assembly, and it jammed in its housing. Loft, whose aircraft it was, engaged with the problem himself. Repo went down into the electronics bay beneath the flight deck, where a small optical sight allows a crew member to look directly at the nose gear and confirm visually whether it is extended and aligned. That is also correct procedure. The gear was, in fact, down and locked the entire time. The indicator had failed because both of its tiny bulbs had burned out. 3 people, one $2 lamp assembly, and an aircraft in a gentle turn at 2,000 feet in absolute darkness over a landscape with no lights on it. The autopilot on the L-1011 could be commanded to hold altitude, and it had a characteristic that the crew almost certainly knew about in theory and did not have in mind that night. Sufficient force applied to the control column would disengage the altitude hold function in that channel, and the disengagement was not announced by anything more than a small change in an annunciator light. The NTSB's investigation concluded that the altitude hold was most likely disconnected inadvertently, and considered it probable that Loft bumped the control column while turning in his seat to speak to Repo about the nose gear. The aircraft began to descend, not steeply, roughly 200 feet per minute at first, which in a wide body at night with no visual horizon is imperceptible. There is no sensation of falling in a stabilized, shallow descent. The inner ear does not detect a constant velocity. The only way to know is to look at an instrument, and all 3 crew members were looking at a light bulb. An altitude alert did sound. On the L-1011, a chime tone enunciates deviation from the selected altitude, and it is audible on the cockpit voice recorder. Nobody responded to it. The flight engineer's station, from which it would have been most likely to be noticed, was empty, because Repo was below in the electronics bay with a flashlight trying to see the nose gear. The airport radar had a display of the aircraft's reported altitude, and the Miami approach controller saw a readout showing the flight down around 900 feet. Controllers in that era were trained to treat such readouts with caution because they were known to produce spurious values, and the flight had been cleared to maintain 2,000 and had said nothing. He asked the crew in ordinary conversational terms how things were coming along out there. The crew answered that they would like to turn around and come back in. Nothing in the exchange communicated an altitude problem because neither party believed there was one. In the last seconds, the crew realized what was happening. The cockpit voice recorder captured Stockstill noticing the altitude and an exclamation from the captain, and then the recording ends. At 11:42 p.m., roughly 18 miles west-northwest of Miami International Airport, the left wingtip struck the marsh. The aircraft was in a shallow left bank at something over 200 miles an hour. It cartwheeled and broke apart across a swath of sawgrass and shallow water more than a quarter of a mile long, and the fuel it was carrying for a diversion and a hold sprayed out across the impact area. And then, immediately, an enormous number of people were alive in the Everglades at night. That is the part of Flight 401 that gets lost behind the famous cockpit story. Of the 176 people on board, roughly 75 survived the impact. The airframe had absorbed the crash the way a modern airliner is designed to, breaking up progressively over distance rather than stopping at once. The accident was survivable. Nothing that followed was decided by aviation. It was decided by the ground. Survivors were scattered through sawgrass and water and mud, in the dark. Most of them injured, many of them trapped in wreckage, in an area saturated with jet fuel. There was no fire in the sense of a burning wreck, and there was fuel in the water and on skin, and in the cuts the sawgrass and the metal had already made. The nearest levee road was not adjacent. There were no lights, no landmarks, no dry ground to move an injured person to, and no way for anyone at the scene to signal a position except by making light themselves. Two men saw the impact from inside the marsh. Robert Marquis, known as Bud, was out that night in his airboat with a companion, Ray Dickinson, hunting frogs. Frogging is a night activity, done with a headlamp, in exactly the kind of shallow interior water where the aircraft came down. Marquis later described seeing the lights of a large jet flying low to the west, and then a ball of fire, an orange glow that lit up and spread out across the glades for what he estimated at thousands of feet. He went toward it. He had an airboat, he knew the water, and he was already in the middle of the one landscape where those two facts were worth more than every emergency vehicle in Dade County. He reached the wreckage roughly 15 minutes after impact, which is a response time no organized agency in South Florida could have produced that night from a standing start. What he found was people in the water, in the sawgrass, in pieces of aircraft, calling out. He and Dickinson began pulling survivors out and putting them where they could be reached. The jet fuel that had sprayed across the impact area got onto him, and it burned his face, arms, and legs. He kept working. When Coast Guard helicopters came out from Opelika, they were flying into a black marsh with no reference points, and Marcus used his headlamp to give them something to fly to, guiding them onto the site. He continued shuttling people and rescuers in and out of the crash area through that night and into the next day. He was not part of any rescue organization. He was a man who happened to be there with the right boat. The formal response, when it assembled, was substantial, and it was slow in the way this landscape makes everything slow. Coast Guard aircraft came from Opelika. Dade County Fire and police units responded by road to whatever access they could find, which meant levee and canal roads, and then transferred to boats. More airboats arrived, many of them privately owned, driven by people who had heard what happened and knew the water. Helicopters lifted survivors out, and the ones who could be moved by boat were taken to a point where ambulances could reach them. Triage happened on a levee, on a strip of dry, crushed rock a few yards wide in the dark, with victims arriving from the marsh a few at a time, at the speed of the boats. A few at a time. Those 4 words describe the whole night. In an urban mass casualty incident, you flood the scene with units and treat volume with volume. Here the scene had a throughput limit set by how many airboats existed and how fast they could shuttle. Survivors lay in fuel-slicked water in the cold of a late December Florida night, some for hours, waiting for a boat that had to make a round trip through sawgrass for each load. The final toll is usually given as 100 on L1 dead of the 176 aboard, and the figure deserves a note because sources differ slightly. Some accounts state 99 deaths at the scene, with additional victims dying later of their injuries, and survivor counts of 75 and 77 both appear in reputable sources. The variation is the ordinary consequence of a mass casualty event with delayed deaths and a chaotic count in the first hours. What is not in dispute is that most of those who died did so on impact, and that a substantial number of people survived the crash of a wide-body airliner and were then held for hours in a marsh that no vehicle could enter. The NTSB's finding, issued in June 1973, is one of the most consequential in aviation history, and it does not mention terrain at all. The probable cause was the failure of the flight crew to monitor the flight instruments during the final 4 minutes of flight and to detect an unexpected descent soon enough to prevent impact with the ground. 3 qualified professionals, all competent, had all become absorbed in the same minor problem, and nobody was flying the aircraft. That finding changed how airline crews are trained worldwide. The accident became a foundational case in what the industry now calls crew resource management, the explicit assignment of one pilot to fly the aircraft while others troubleshoot, the discipline of announcing and acknowledging who has control, the flattening of cockpit hierarchy so that a junior crew member can say the altitude is wrong and be heard. Flight 401 is taught in every airline training department on Earth. It also fed directly into the mandating of ground proximity warning systems in U.S. airliners in the mid-1970s, a device that does one thing: it looks down, sees terrain approaching, and shouts about it regardless of what anybody in the cockpit is preoccupied with. Those were real fixes. They addressed the actual cause. The rate of controlled flight into terrain in commercial aviation fell dramatically in the decades that followed, and it fell because of accidents like this one. Bud Marquis received no formal recognition for a very long time. In December 2007, 35 years after the crash, the National Air Disaster Alliance and Foundation presented him with a humanitarian award. An Airboat Search and Rescue Association gave him one of its own, and the Miami-Dade County Commissioners proclaimed the 3rd of December Robert Marquis Day. 35 years. The man who reached a wide-body crash site before any agency in the county and who then held a light up so that helicopters could find it, went home to the Glades and stayed there. Now, the question this story has been building toward since the first levee was mentioned. Between 1972 and 1996, the capability to respond to a disaster in the Everglades improved in every measurable way. Radio interoperability improved. Incident command systems were formalized and rehearsed, helicopter fleets modernized, with better night vision equipment, thermal imaging, and hoists. Hazardous materials teams became standard in metropolitan fire departments. Emergency medicine improved beyond recognition. Miami-Dade's population and its emergency services both grew enormously, and the highway network reached further west. So, did any of it change what the Everglades does to a disaster? There is a clean test of that question, and it happened on 11 May 1996. About 10 miles from where Flight 401 came down. ValueJet Airlines Flight 592 was a McDonnell Douglas DC-932, registration N904VJ, scheduled from Miami International to Atlanta. ValueJet was a low-cost carrier that had grown extraordinarily fast, from a startup in 1993 to a fleet of more than 50 aircraft, by buying older airplanes cheaply and contracting out most of its maintenance rather than performing it in-house. That business model is not inherently unsafe. It does mean that the carrier's safety depends on how well it supervises companies it does not employ, and the FAA's supervision depends on inspectors keeping pace with an airline adding aircraft faster than the agency added people to watch it. The chain that destroyed Flight 592 began not on the aircraft but in a maintenance hangar, and it began with a piece of safety equipment. Above every airline passenger seat is an emergency oxygen supply. On many aircraft, it is not a tank. It is a chemical oxygen generator, a steel canister containing sodium chlorate, which when initiated by a small percussion device begins an exothermic reaction that releases oxygen for a fixed period, typically 12 to 15 minutes. The reaction cannot be stopped once it has started. It produces oxygen and it produces heat, and the case of an activated generator can reach temperatures high enough to ignite materials it is in contact with. That is normal. In service, the generator sits in a metal housing with clearances designed around that heat. ValueJet had 3 MD-80s undergoing heavy maintenance at a facility operated by SaberTech in Miami. Part of that work involved replacing time-expired oxygen generators. Removed generators, being at or past their expiration dates but chemically unexpended, are hazardous material. The procedure for making them safe is straightforward. Fit a shipping cap over the firing pin so the generator cannot be initiated by shock. Caps were not available at the facility. Mechanics removed the generators anyway, and on the work cards signed the step-off. The generators went into cardboard boxes. Bubble wrap was put in with them. At some point they were labeled as aircraft parts and moved towards shipping, and someone wrote oxy canisters, and the word empty appeared in the paperwork, which was a description of the aircraft's requirement rather than the canister's state. 5 boxes were prepared for return to ValueJet as company-owned material, the industry term for an airline's own property being carried on its own aircraft rather than as commercial freight. Company material does not go through the hazardous materials acceptance process that a shipper's cargo would. ValueJet's own operations manual prohibited carrying hazardous materials. The airline was not certified to carry them. The NTSB later found that the carrier had failed to ensure that its own employees and its contractors' employees understood that policy and had received appropriate hazardous materials training. On the morning of 11 May 1996, the 5 boxes were loaded into the forward cargo compartment of N904VJ, along with 2 main tires and a nose tire. The cargo compartment was a Class D hold, a design that has no fire detection and no fire suppression, on the principle that a sealed compartment starved of oxygen will smother a fire on its own. That principle is sound for ordinary cargo. It is meaningless against a device whose entire purpose is to manufacture oxygen. Flight 592 was delayed and pushed back late. It took off from Miami at 2:04 p.m. with 105 passengers, 2 pilots, and 3 flight attendants. Captain Candlin Kubek was in command, with First Officer Richard Hazen. The climb-out was normal. 6 minutes later, at roughly 2:10 p.m., the flight deck recorded sounds consistent with something failing in the cabin, and the crew reported smoke in the cockpit and in the cabin to air traffic control, and requested an immediate return to Miami. Miami Approach began turning the flight back and offered a heading toward the airport. On the cockpit voice recorder, there are shouts from the passenger cabin audible through the flight deck door. Reconstruct what was actually happening below them, because the timeline is brutal and the crew's options were disappearing faster than any procedure could keep up with. At least one generator in those boxes was initiated, most probably by the ordinary jolts of loading and takeoff, acting on a firing pin that no cap was covering. It began producing oxygen and heat inside a cardboard box packed with bubble wrap, inside a sealed compartment, next to 4 more boxes of the same devices and 3 aircraft tires. The heat ignited the packing material. The fire, instead of consuming the available oxygen and dying as a Class D compartment is designed to make it do, was fed by generators that manufacture oxygen as a chemical product and cannot be switched off. Each additional generator that reached its initiation temperature added more. An oxygen-fed fire in an enclosed space does not behave like a normal fire. It burns hotter, it burns faster, and it consumes materials that would ordinarily be considered fire-resistant. Within a very short time, it was through the cabin floor. The crew had a smoke emergency and a turn toward Miami, and they had perhaps 120 seconds of controllable aircraft. That is not enough to reach an airport 10 minutes behind you. It is barely enough to run a checklist. The fire attacked the structure and the control cables and the electrical systems in the forward part of the aircraft, and control was lost. At about 2:13 p.m., roughly 10 minutes after takeoff, Flight 592 struck the Everglades in a steep, high-speed descent, nose down and right wing low, in Water Conservation Area 3B, in the ground between 2 levee canals designated L67A and L67C, an area known locally as the L67 Pocket. There were no survivors. All 110 people aboard died at impact, and now the environment took over the story completely in a way that has no real parallel in American accident investigation. At the speed and angle it arrived, the DC-9 did not crash onto the Everglades. It went into it. The surface there is a few feet of water over deep, soft muck over limestone, and an aircraft of that mass arriving nearly vertically drove into that column and disintegrated. There was no fuselage lying in the marsh. There was no tail section, no recognizable wing, no rows of seats. From the levee, aerial photographs of the site show a disturbed patch of sawgrass, a stain of fuel on the water, and pieces of aluminum, small enough that most of them could be lifted by hand. Then the muck closed over the hole. Getting people to that patch of marsh was the first problem. A dirt road on the levee ran to a point roughly 300 yards west of the impact site, and reaching that point by vehicle from the nearest major access road, the Tamiami Trail, took over an hour. 300 yards from the road to the wreckage, and it took an airboat because you could not walk it carrying equipment. That was the arrangement for the next several weeks. Command post and morgue on a levee. Everything and everybody moving to and from the site by airboat, a few at a time. The hazards on site were a list nobody had prepared for as a package. The water was contaminated with jet fuel, which burned skin on prolonged contact and which had saturated the impact area. The muck was biologically active and full of decomposition. The debris was aluminum sheet torn into pieces with edges like razors, invisible under opaque water. Sawgrass surrounded everything. The site was in an active alligator habitat, and the recovery attracted them. It was May in South Florida, with air temperatures around 90 degrees and no shade anywhere in the landscape. So the divers went in wearing full biohazard suits, sealed, in 90-degree heat, with chest-high waders for those working the shallows. They could not see. Visibility in disturbed Everglades muck is essentially zero, so the work was done by feel, hands moving through mud and debris, searching a grid. When they came out, hazmat crews decontaminated them as they stepped off the airboats. A marksman was posted to watch the water for alligators while people worked. Heat exhaustion limited how long anyone could stay in a sealed suit, which meant short shifts, which meant more shuttling, which meant airboats running continuously. Reports from the operation describe a working environment that combined every hazard this landscape has: chemical, biological, mechanical, thermal, and animal. In water you could not see through on a site that could only be entered and left by boat. The recorders were both in there somewhere. The flight data recorder was located within a few days, pulled from the muck by divers working blind, and the cockpit voice recorder took considerably longer to find. Engines were located and recovered. Fragments of the cargo compartment liner and pieces of the oxygen generators themselves were eventually retrieved and became the physical evidence at the center of the investigation, which is remarkable when you consider that they had to be found by hand, in mud, by people who could not see them. The human recovery was worse, and it should be described plainly and briefly. There were no intact remains to recover. Over the course of the operation, remains were recovered in fragments, and the identifications that could be made were made from those fragments. Accounts of the operation state that the recovered remains permitted positive identification of 61 of the 110 people aboard, though the exact identification count varies between sources and later reporting. Families were told, in the first days, what the ground was and what it meant, which is a conversation nobody in aviation had ever had to have, in quite those terms. Now put that next to 1972 and look at what actually changed. In 1972, an airliner crashed in the Everglades, and 75 people were alive in the marsh, and the response was slow because the ground made it slow, and a frog hunter in an airboat beat every organized agency to the scene. In 1996, an airliner crashed in the same marsh 10 miles away, and the response was fast, coordinated, professionally commanded, equipped with modern helicopters, hazmat capability, and a unified structure that put hundreds of trained personnel on the levee within hours. It made no difference whatsoever. Not because the responders failed, because there was nobody to rescue, and because the only remaining task, recovery, is the one task the Everglades is best at defeating. 24 years of improvement in emergency response bought a great deal, and none of what it bought applied to the problem that was actually presented. The harder version of that lesson deserves saying without any softening at all. The Everglades did not make Flight 592 crash. A sequence of decisions on the ground in Miami did that, and the NTSB's report, AAR 9706, laid them out. SaberTech's failure to properly prepare, package, and identify the generators. ValueJet's failure to ensure that its own and its contractors' employees knew and applied its no-carry hazardous materials policy. And the FAA's failure to require fire detection and suppression in Class D cargo compartments, to adequately monitor ValueJet's heavy maintenance program and its oversight of contractors, and to respond adequately to previous chemical oxygen generator fires. The Everglades' contribution came afterward. It absorbed the aircraft so completely that the investigation had to be conducted by hand, blind, in contaminated water, by divers in sealed suits with a rifleman watching for alligators. The regulatory answer came, and it was substantial, and it matters a great deal which part of the system it fixed. In 1998, the FAA issued a rule requiring smoke detection in all Class D cargo compartments on passenger aircraft and fire suppression in those compartments, effectively eliminating the design category that had allowed a fire to burn undetected under a passenger cabin. That rule is why an equivalent fire on a modern airliner announces itself on the flight deck within seconds and is met with an extinguishing agent. Sabertech was prosecuted in a case that went through federal and state courts with mixed and partially overturned outcomes. ValueJet was grounded for several months, resumed operations, and in 1997 merged with AirTran, taking the AirTran name. The fix addressed the mechanism. It did not, and could not, address the constraint that turned an accident into a 3-week hand search in contaminated mud. Nothing addresses that. There is no regulation that makes the Everglades reachable. There is a coda to that, and it belongs here rather than in a footnote because it says something about the ground that no accident report does. When the recovery ended, the site did not become a site. There was nothing to preserve, no wreckage to cordon, no scar that would stay visible. Sawgrass regrows. Within a few seasons, the impact area was indistinguishable from the marsh around it, which meant that families of the 110 had a location without a place, a set of coordinates in water. A memorial was eventually built for them, and its position tells you everything. It stands north of the Tamiami Trail, along the canal, on the unpaved access road near the L67 lock, a short distance east of where the aircraft went in, and still some miles from it across open marsh. It is not at the crash site because you cannot build anything at the crash site. Families who come out on the anniversary drive a dirt levee road to a strip of dry ground beside a canal and look west at Sawgrass. And that is as close as anyone gets. Which brings the question down from 110 people to 1. If that landscape can take a 50-ton aircraft arriving at several hundred miles an hour and reduce the recovery to divers feeling for fragments in zero visibility, what exactly does it do to a single human being who walks into it or poles into it or takes a boat into the wrong creek? It hides them, completely and reliably. And a certain kind of person has always understood that as an opportunity rather than a danger. Go west and south from the Sawgrass, and the landscape changes character without becoming any friendlier. Where the freshwater sheet meets the tide, Sawgrass gives way to mangrove, and on the southwest coast the mangrove is not a fringe. It is a forest built on water, tens of miles deep in places, and the coast it forms is the 10,000 islands. A scatter of mangrove keys, oyster bars, tidal creeks, bays, and dead-end channels running from Everglades City south toward Cape Sable. Mangroves grow on their own roots. Red mangrove stands on arching prop roots that lift the trunk above the water and interlock into a dense mechanical tangle, and the sediment that accumulates among them is soft black mud that will not hold a person's weight. You cannot walk in a mangrove forest, you cannot swim through it, you cannot even reliably wade at the edge of one, because the mud takes your leg and the roots hold you. If your boat fails in a mangrove creek, you are not standing in 14 inches of water with a bad 4-mile walk ahead of you. You are in a place with no walkable surface at all. And unlike the Sawgrass, this landscape moves. Tides in the 10,000 islands run a couple of feet, and in narrow creeks that translates into current that can exceed what a paddler can push against. A channel that carried you in at high water can be a mudflat 6 hours later with your boat sitting on it. The mangrove tunnels of the interior creeks close overhead into green corridors barely wide enough for a canoe, and the one on the wilderness waterway that paddlers call the Nightmare is passable only near high tide. Now add the feature that makes it genuinely disorienting. From a boat in the 10,000 Islands, every island looks the same. Mangrove at the waterline, mangrove above it. No beach, no rock, no distinguishing profile. In a maze of hundreds of them. Charts exist, and they are essential. And they still leave experienced boaters going in circles, because the visual field offers nothing to attach a chart to. This is the coast where Everglades City sits, at the mouth of the Barren River, on the western edge of the park, at the end of State Road 29, which is the only road in. The town was built by Baron Collier, an advertising millionaire who bought enormous holdings in southwest Florida in the 1920s and made the place his base while building the Tamiami Trail. It was briefly a county seat. Then the county seat moved to Naples after Hurricane Donna in 1960, and what remained was a small settlement of a few hundred people whose economy was fishing: stone crab, mullet, grouper, shrimp. Families had worked those waters for generations, and the knowledge involved is exactly the knowledge this story keeps describing. Which creek connects to which bay? Which bar covers at what tide? Where you can run at night without a chart because your hands know it. Then, over 3 decades, that economy was legislated out of existence, and the legislation was not unreasonable. Everglades National Park was established in 1947, and commercial fishermen were assured they could keep working waters they had fished for generations. The restrictions came anyway, in steps. In 1951, nets were banned from the park's rivers, bays, and inland waters. Commercial shrimping permits were frozen in 1956 and prohibited by 1960. In 1965, the park cut the number of crab traps a single operator could run from 400 to 200 and closed further areas. In 1974, the creation of Big Cypress National Preserve added another layer of federal land and federal rules to the north. In September 1979, the National Park Service published its final position in the Federal Register. All commercial fishing in the park, crabbing included, would end completely, effective 31st December 1985. Take that from the perspective of a man in Everglades City in 1980. You are 35. Your father and grandfather crabbed these waters. Your boat, your traps, and your entire professional knowledge are specific to a fishery that has a legal expiration date 5 years out. The nearest town with other work is Naples, 40 miles up a 2-lane road. You have a skill set of extraordinary value that is about to become worth nothing. And that skill set is moving small boats through the 10,000 islands at night without lights, without charts, without being seen. There was a market for exactly that. Through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, South Florida was the primary entry point for marijuana and cocaine into the United States, and the marijuana trade in particular ran on a simple physical model. A mothership stands offshore in international water with tons of baled marijuana. Small, fast boats run out, load, and bring it in. The bottleneck is the last 20 miles because that is where the Coast Guard and Customs are, and that is where a boat has to make a coastline and offload without being intercepted. The 10,000 islands were, for that purpose, close to perfect. Hundreds of miles of shoreline with no roads behind it. Thousands of creeks. Radar performance degraded by mangrove clutter. Local men who could run a loaded boat through channels a pursuing vessel would ground in at night, in fog, on a falling tide. Bales that went overboard washed up in the mangroves and got a nickname, square grouper, which tells you how normal it became. The money bore no relation to fishing. Contemporary accounts describe men earning as much as $10,000 for a night's work moving a load, at a time when a hard month of crabbing might not produce that. And this is where the moral picture gets complicated in the way real places always do. This was not a cartel arriving and taking over a town. It was a fishing community with a dying trade and a valuable skill, being offered a great deal of money to use that skill by people who had correctly identified that the skill existed. Participation spread through families and crews the way any work does in a small town. Federal agencies knew what was happening and could not stop it on the water. And the reason they could not stop it on the water is the reason this entire story exists. You cannot patrol a coastline that has no line. You cannot blockade a maze whose entrances number in the hundreds and whose local operators know which of them are passable at which stage of the tide. Interdiction assumes you can be between the smuggler and the shore. In the 10,000 islands, there is no between. So they did the only thing the geography permits, which is exactly what the Army had eventually done in 1840. They stopped trying to beat the terrain and worked around it. The operation took 2 years, and it was built on undercover work and informants rather than pursuit. Then, on the morning of 7 July 1983, more than 200 officers from the Drug Enforcement Administration, the FBI, the Internal Revenue Service, the Coast Guard, and the Collier County Sheriff's Office moved on the town at once. State Road 29, the only road into Everglades City, was sealed at 5 in the morning. Boats worked the mangroves. Aircraft and helicopters held overhead. There was no back way out, because for the purpose of moving people and vehicles, there is no back way out. The same isolation that had protected the trade closed around it. Operation Everglades netted 28 people in that first sweep, 12 of them from Everglades City and neighboring Chokoloskee, 16 from Naples and elsewhere in Florida. A second phase, Lartito Alsing Trakin Tempuari, on 30th June 1984, produced 19 more indictments. Taken as a whole, the joint federal, state, and county investigation resulted in the arrest or indictment of 256 people and the seizure of more than 580,000 pounds of marijuana valued at over $250 million, along with boats, vehicles, and property worth several million more. In a town of a few hundred people, a substantial share of the adult men went to prison. Some estimates from residents run higher than the indictment figures because the effect on a community that size is not measured in charges filed. Wives ran households alone. Children grew up visiting federal facilities, and the fishing economy that the trade had substituted for was, by then, legally finished anyway. The park ban took effect at the end of 1985, and Florida's constitutional ban on entangling nets in state waters passed by referendum in 1994 and took effect on 1st May on 1st July 1995, closing what remained of the mullet fishery. What replaced it was tourism, airboat rides, stone crab in season, fishing guides, and a small town at the end of a road that now markets the same water it once used to hide in. There is the reversal, and it is not a comfortable one. Every property of this landscape that makes it lethal to a lost person is a functional asset to someone who wants not to be found. Trackless, roadless, radar-cluttered, uniform in appearance, hostile to pursuit, impossible to seal. The Everglades does not distinguish between a person who is hiding and a person who is lost. It provides the same service to both, and it charges the same price. And that price has not changed as much as the equipment has, which is the last thing this story has to prove, because someone is now reasonably thinking all of that was before satellite navigation, before mobile phones, before personal locator beacons, before thermal cameras and modern hoist-equipped helicopters. A person in trouble in the Everglades today is not in the position of a soldier in 1840, or a farm worker in 1928, or a survivor lying in fuel-slicked water in 1972. They have a device in their pocket that knows exactly where they are. That is true. It is also the most dangerous half-truth in modern outdoor recreation. And the Everglades exposes it more cleanly than almost anywhere else. Consider what those technologies actually deliver, item by item, without generosity and without cynicism. Satellite navigation tells you your position to within a few meters continuously, and it will do it in the middle of a 60-mile marsh with no landmarks. That is an enormous gain, and it solves the specific problem that has killed people here for 2 centuries, not knowing which way to go. With a GPS receiver and a downloaded map, you can pick the nearest levee and walk a bearing to it with confidence. It does not make you faster. You still cross sawgrass at under a mile an hour. You still probe for solution holes. You still cannot rest, and you still cannot drink, and the levee is still 4 miles away. A GPS converts an unknown ordeal into a known ordeal. That is worth a great deal, and it is not the same as rescue. Mobile phone coverage is real over large parts of the Everglades because towers along the Tamiami Trail, Interstate 75, and the developed East Coast throw signal a long way over flat open marsh with nothing to block it. From a canoe in an open slough, you may well have bars. Drop into a mangrove creek on the southwest coast, or into a cypress dome, or simply put a few miles of distance and some terrain between yourself and the nearest tower, and it goes. Coverage over the Everglades is a patchwork, and the patches do not correspond to anything you can see. A personal locator beacon or a satellite messenger solves the notification problem outright. And this is the genuine revolution. Activate one, and a distress signal with your coordinates goes to a satellite constellation, and from there to a rescue coordination center, which contacts the appropriate agency, which begins a response. And none of that depends on anyone noticing you are late. Recognition, the stage that used to cost the most hours, collapses to minutes. Then everything after recognition proceeds at exactly the speed it did in 1972. That is the whole point. And it is why the modern era in this landscape is more dangerous than it looks rather than less. Notification improved by orders of magnitude. Access improved not at all. The airboat is still the fast door. The levee is still where the ambulance waits. The helicopter still cannot land, so it still has to hover and hoist, and it still cannot do that at 2 sites simultaneously. The last few hundred yards are still the slowest part of the trip. The gap between those 2 curves is where people get hurt now. Knowing your position and being able to tell someone your position feels enormously like safety. It produces confidence. Confidence produces range, a longer paddle, a later start, a route that skips the easy exit, a decision to keep going because help is a button away, and a button that summons help does not shorten the distance help has to travel. There is a route through the Southwest Everglades that demonstrates the point better than any argument. It is called the Wilderness Waterway. It runs 99 miles between Everglades City and Flamingo through the interior of the mangrove country, and it is the marked, official, well-documented way to cross that landscape by small boat. Roughly 40 designated campsites lie along it, a mixture of beach sites, ground sites on the few pieces of raised shell and marl, and chickees, which are wooden platforms built on pilings over open water with a roof and a chemical toilet and nothing else, because in many stretches there is simply no ground to camp on. Most paddlers allow at least 8 days. The Park Service and every guide to the route say plainly that it is for experienced paddlers. 3 nautical charts, numbers 11 30, 11 32, and 11 33 are required to cover it. Now think about what the design of that route tells you. They built platforms on stilts because there is nowhere to put a tent. That is not a convenience feature. It is an admission that for miles at a stretch, along an official recreational route inside a national park, there is no surface a human being can lie down on. If you are on that stretch and something goes wrong, there is no shore to pull out on, no bank to climb, and no dry ground within reach. You are on the water or you are in the mangroves, and the mangroves will not hold you. The navigation problem is the one that catches competent people. The route runs through a succession of bays, rivers, and creeks that are genuinely, physically similar to one another. Guides to the waterway describe the mazes of mangrove-lined creeks and bays as beginning to look the same, and that is the accurate description rather than a warning label. Numbered markers exist along the route, and they are spaced for power boats, sometimes far enough apart that a paddler loses sight of one before finding the next. Sections of the route pass through creeks narrow enough that the mangrove closes overhead, and the passage that everyone remembers, the one called the Nightmare, is only passable near high tide, which means that navigating it is not a question of skill or effort, but of arriving in a specific 2-hour window on a specific day. The tide is making your schedule there, exactly the way the wet and dry seasons made the schedule for people poling dugouts 300 years ago. The equipment changed completely. The constraint did not move an inch. Add wind, because the open bays are where the modern accidents happen. Whitewater Bay and the larger open water on the route are shallow, and shallow water builds a short, steep, closely spaced chop very quickly under wind, far more punishing for a loaded canoe than the longer swell of deep water, because the waves arrive before the hull has recovered from the last one. A 15-knot afternoon sea breeze across 2 miles of open bay can stop a tandem canoe dead. It can also push a boat, over an hour, well off the line the paddlers think they are holding, into a shoreline that all looks alike. And in summer, the thunderstorms. South Florida has among the highest lightning strike densities in the United States, and afternoon convection in the wet season is close to daily. On a mangrove coast with no elevation, the safest place in a thunderstorm is inside a building, and the nearest building may be 30 miles away. The paddler's option is to get off the water and into low mangrove, which means standing in mud among roots while the cell passes. Now run a modern emergency through that landscape properly, stage by stage, and watch where the hours accumulate. Say a paddler on the middle of the waterway suffers a serious injury at 4 in the afternoon on day 4. Their satellite messenger works. They activate it, and the distress goes out with coordinates. This is the actual revolution, and it functions. Within a short time, a rescue coordination center has the position and is contacting the appropriate agency, which inside park boundaries means the National Park Service, with the Coast Guard, County Fire Rescue, and Florida wildlife officers as available partners depending on where the position falls. Now, the response has to be built. Someone has to decide what asset goes. A boat from Flamingo or Everglades City may be 2 to 3 hours of running time from a mid-route position, depending on which end is closer and whether the route in is passable at the current tide. A helicopter is far faster in transit and can be overhead in well under an hour, and when it arrives, it faces the actual problem. There is nowhere to land, so the answer is a hoist. And a hoist over mangrove is a demanding evolution because the trees are 10 to 20 feet tall, and the rotor wash does not reveal a surface underneath. It just moves the canopy around. If the injured person is in a creek under closed mangrove canopy, the aircraft cannot reach them at all. They have to be moved to open water first by whoever is with them, in a canoe, which may take an hour and may not be possible at all if they cannot be moved. Then, daylight. If the incident happens late in the day, everything above happens in darkness, which does not stop a modern crew but slows every stage of it and narrows the margins on the hoist. Then, the handoff. A hoisted patient goes to a hospital in an hour. A patient recovered by boat goes to a ramp, and the ramp is at the end of a long run, and an ambulance meets them there. Best case, in daylight, in good weather, with a working beacon, on open water, a couple of hours. Realistic case, at dusk, with wind, under canopy, at low tide, most of a night. And that is with everything working, every agency responding, and the position known to within a few meters from the first minute. There is the final reversal, and it is the one that matters most to anyone reading this who might actually go out there. Knowing exactly where you are is not the same as being reachable. The Everglades did not become safer when it became mapped, tracked, and continuously located. It became precisely as dangerous as it always was, with the danger relocated to a later point in the sequence, and made much harder to see coming, because everything before that point now works beautifully. The National Park Service records well over 1 million visits a year to Everglades National Park, and the overwhelming majority of those people never leave a boardwalk, a tram road, or a tour boat, and are never in any danger at all. The exposure is concentrated in a small number of people going into the interior: paddlers, backcountry campers, hunters in the water conservation areas, airboat operators, fishermen in the 10,000 islands, and the scientists and water managers whose work is out there. And most of them come back fine, most of the time, because they are competent, and the margins usually hold. The margins are just thinner than they look, and they are thin in a specific direction, not the direction people watch, and the landscape those margins are measured against is currently being rewritten deliberately at one end and involuntarily at the other. The deliberate end is restoration. After half a century of building a system designed to move water away from the Everglades as fast as possible, the state and federal governments concluded that the system had worked too well. The marsh was starved, Florida Bay was becoming too salty, wading bird populations had collapsed by around 90% from their historical numbers, and the aquifer that supplies drinking water to millions of people depends on the same recharge the canals were diverting. In 2000, Congress authorized the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, a multi-decade program of dozens of projects intended to capture, store, and redeliver water on something closer to a natural timing and volume. The most visible piece of it is a road. The Tamiami Trail, US 41, was completed across the Everglades in 1928, the same year as the hurricane, and it did something nobody thought about at the time. It acted as a dam. A raised roadbed running east to west across a landscape whose water moves north to south blocks the flow along its entire length, and for 80 years it held water back on the north side and starved Shark River Slough, the main channel of fresh water, into the southern park, on the other. The fix was to lift the road onto bridges. A 1-mile bridge opened in 2013 and a 2.5-mile bridge was completed at the end of the decade, and water now moves south under them, in volumes it had not moved in generations. That is genuinely good work, and it is changing the physical conditions in the southern Everglades in ways that matter to anyone who goes into it. More water in Shark River Slough means deeper water across areas that had been drying out. Deeper water changes which sawgrass ridges an airboat can cross and which will strand it. It changes where tree islands sit relative to the surface, and tree islands are the only dry ground. It changes the seasonal timing of when the interior is navigable and when it is not. It even changes where alligators concentrate, because alligators concentrate in the deep holes during the dry season, and restoration alters which holes are deep. Sit with the implication for a moment. For thousands of years, the calendar that governed movement through the Everglades was set by rainfall. For most of the 20th century, it was set by rainfall plus a network of gates and pumps operated to a regulation schedule. It is still set that way, and the schedule is now being revised with ecological objectives added to flood control and water supply. The single most important variable for anyone traveling that landscape, how deep the water is, and therefore what can move across it, is partly a policy decision made in an office in West Palm Beach. The involuntary end of the rewriting is the coast, and there the changes are not being designed. Sea level along South Florida is rising, and the Everglades has almost no elevation to absorb it. Saltwater is pushing inland both as surface water in the tidal creeks and, more insidiously, underground, moving the boundary between fresh and salt groundwater landward beneath the marsh. Where that saline front arrives under freshwater peat, it does something that ought to be impossible in a landscape that has been accumulating soil for 5,000 years. The peat collapses. Sawgrass, which is a freshwater plant, dies. The microbial processes that build and hold peat are disrupted. The soil surface loses elevation, and the marsh converts to open water, leaving a pockmarked pattern of brackish pools where continuous marsh used to be. The reasonable assumption is that mangrove simply moves inland to replace it, and mangrove is migrating inland along the southwest coast and into the lower reaches of the sloughs. But the research on this is careful, and the finding is not reassuring. Experimental work in Florida, coastal Everglades marshes, has shown that saltwater intrusion drives rapid soil elevation loss and carbon loss. And modeling of the system indicates that a combination of sea level rise, reduced freshwater flow from upstream management, and saltwater intrusion can cause peat to disappear faster than it can accumulate. So the affected area converts to open water rather than to mangrove forest. Whether mangroves establish or the marsh simply drowns depends heavily on how much fresh water is delivered from upstream, which loops the involuntary change back into the deliberate one. None of that makes the Everglades safer, and none of it makes it more dangerous in a simple direction. That is the honest statement, and the temptation to improve on it should be resisted. More water in the central Everglades means better boat access along some routes and less walkable ground along others. Higher water reduces the dry season stretches where you can cross on foot, and it extends the season when the interior is navigable by hull. Coastal peat collapse converts marsh to open water, which is easier to boat across and offers even less to stand on, in a zone where the tidal creeks are already the hardest navigation on the coast. Every change moves the danger somewhere. None of them remove it, because none of them touch the underlying facts. The gradient is still 2 inches per mile, there is still no elevation, the sawgrass is still sawgrass, and the only fast way in is still a boat with the propeller in the air. And the number of people out there is not falling. Everglades National Park draws more than 1 million visits a year. The water conservation areas north of it are open to hunting and airboating under state management, and on a good weekend, there are hundreds of private boats in the interior. Air tours, fishing guides, and airboat operators run daily from both coasts. State agencies pay contract python removal agents who work the levee roads and the marsh margins at night on foot, in exactly the conditions this whole story has been describing, because that is when the snakes are findable. Scientists and water managers maintain instruments at sites that can only be reached by airboat or helicopter. All of those people are exposed to the same system, and most of them will never see it operate, because the system only becomes visible when something has already gone wrong. So put the whole thing together, because the pattern is consistent across 2 centuries and every level of technology, and it is not a pattern about nature being powerful. Geography sets the constraint, and the constraint is a number, 2 inches of fall per mile across 100 miles of limestone. That single figure produces everything else. It prevents channels from forming, so there is no river to follow and no bank to land on. It spreads the water into a sheet that is neither navigable nor walkable, which eliminates almost every vehicle humans have built. It creates a surface with no elevation, which removes the ability to see, to orient, to sleep dry, and to warm up. Weather activates the constraint rather than creating it. Rain in the wet season raises the sheet and makes the interior navigable by hull and impossible on foot. The dry season strands boats and concentrates water into holes. A frontal passage in January puts a soaked person into 40-degree air with wind in the one part of the country where nobody packs for cold. A hurricane takes a shallow lake with no depth to absorb the push and stacks it against a shore where people live. None of that is unusual weather. It is ordinary South Florida weather meeting a landscape with no slope, no shelter, and no high ground. Human motive is what puts people in position for any of it to matter. Nobody was in the Everglades by accident. Soldiers were there because federal policy required removal, and the interior was the only place left. Farm workers were on the lake's southern rim in September because that is where the beans were. And because the ground had been sold to their employers as reclaimed land. 2 airline crews were over the marsh because the route from the northeast into Miami and the departure path toward Atlanta both cross it, and because a holding pattern west of the airport is standard procedure. Fishermen were in the 10,000 islands because their families had fished that coast for a century, and some of them were there at night, with the lights off, because the fishery they were raised in had a legal expiration date, and the alternative paid $10,000 for one run. Paddlers are on the Wilderness Waterway because it is one of the great wilderness routes in North America, and it is genuinely worth doing. The motives are ordinary. That is the point. This is not a place people are lured into. It is a place people have consistently had good reasons to enter. Technology changes what is possible without changing what is required. Canoes solved the mobility problem in the 18th century by lifting the traveler's eyes above the sawgrass, and nothing since has improved on that principle as much as it improved on the hardware. Dredges and canals converted marsh into farmland and, in the process, oxidized 6 feet of soil into the atmosphere and left towns sitting below a lake behind an earthen bank. Levees built for flood control accidentally became the only roads into the interior, and every rescue since has run off them. The airboat solved access and remains the answer, 80 years on, because nothing better has been invented for a surface that is neither land nor water. Autopilots and ground proximity warning systems and crew resource management fixed the specific failure that put Flight 401 into the marsh, and cargo compartment fire detection and suppression fixed the specific failure that brought down Flight 592. And both fixes worked, and neither of them made the ground underneath either crash any easier to reach. Satellite beacons collapsed the notification delay from hours to minutes and left the travel delay exactly where it was. Distance decides the outcome every time. Not the alligators, which almost never matter. Not the pythons, which never do. Not even the injury or the illness or the cold, considered on their own. What decides whether an emergency in the Everglades becomes a bad night or a fatality is how many miles of sawgrass and mangrove sit between the person in trouble and the nearest levee, ramp, or open water where a hoist can work, multiplied by the fact that everything crossing that distance moves at the speed of a boat, pushing across matted vegetation in the dark. And history repeats the demonstration with almost insulting consistency. In 1839, an experienced colonel lost most of a detachment on the Caloosahatchee and got out in his nightclothes. In 1840, the Army finally reached the interior by copying exactly the canoes and the timing and the concealment of the people it was hunting, and still could not hold a landscape with nothing to hold. In 1928, at least 2,500 people died because shallow water piled up by wind had nowhere to drain, and no one could count how many had been in the labor camps to begin with. In 1972, 75 people survived a wide-body impact and then waited in fuel-slicked water for a boat, and the first person to reach them was a frog hunter who was already out there. In 1996, the response was fast, modern, coordinated, and entirely beside the point, and the investigation came down to divers feeling through mud they could not see into, 300 yards from a road that took an hour to drive to. Same trap, different equipment, every time. Which is why the honest answer to the question this started with is not about danger at all. A wetland shallow enough to stand up in 40 minutes from downtown Miami stops anyone from reaching you in time because it is not a place. It is a surface that eliminates the 3 things every rescue depends on: speed, orientation, and access. Take those away and everything else, all the training, all the aircraft, all the satellites, arrives at whatever pace the ground allows. The system is still running. It is running right now in the dark, 30 miles west of a city of 6 million people. Some of what made it lethal has been rebuilt. The muck dike is gone, replaced by a proper engineered structure 140 miles around the lake. The Class D cargo hold is gone from passenger aviation. The nose gear light that killed 101 people would today be accompanied by a synthetic voice announcing terrain. Bud Markey got his award 35 years late and died 11 months after receiving it, at 79, of injuries from an ordinary accident that had nothing to do with any of this. And a great deal has not changed at all. The gradient is still 2 inches per mile. The sawgrass is still 9 feet tall, with silica teeth on both edges of every blade. The water is still not drinkable, and the fish still carry a state advisory. The tree islands are still the only dry ground, and the sloughs are still the only routes, and neither of them is marked. The mangrove tunnels still close overhead, and the Nightmare is still only passable at high tide. Helicopters still cannot land, so they still hover and hoist, one at a time. And a mile of that country, at night, with a stretcher, still costs about an hour. Somewhere out on a levee before dawn, an airboat sits on a trailer with its engine ticking as it warms, headlight aimed west into nothing. Water on both sides, black and flat, holding the light for a few yards, and then giving up. The driver checks the fuel, checks the radio, backs the trailer down the ramp, and pushes off into a slough that will not look any different a mile from here, or 5, or 20. The engine comes up. The boat lifts onto the water and slides out over the grass, and behind it the sawgrass folds back down where it passed. And in a minute the channel it left is gone, and there is nothing to show that anyone came this way at all.